Okay, one of the things I did is I went to the internet and I says, well, let's get an example of prevalence for Contra Costa County. So I looked up some of the statistics, and first of all, if we want to present as a percentage, I have to know the population. So the population is about 1.1 million people. And then it said that the confirmed cases was 1,259 confirmed cases and 36 deaths. This was on May 23rd that I looked up these statistics. And then I had the question that we were talking about earlier, what is a confirmed case? And so I really started trying to figure out what they meant by confirmed case, and I really couldn't find a good answer until I went back to my roots. And my roots included let's see what we got here. My roots were up in Canada. And so they had I thought they had a very good way of displaying things. And so I'm going to show you the way they talk about this in Canada. And this is tracking the COVID-19 cases in Canada. And so here's kind of where you're going to learn more about Canada than you probably care to know. Can anyone name what the province is that I have my pointer pointing at? That happens to be Alberta. So anyway, so what they do is they have a little app that they report total cases. Well, they say, here's the total cases. And then they say 34,000 are active, 44,000 have recovered, and there's 6,000 deaths. You know, I'm just rounding out. And
Bob, what's the population of Canada?
The population of Canada is same as California.
Got it.
You know, about 35 million or something like that. And so let me just show you this graph. And first I'm going to show you about Canada. And then it's a kind of a nice app. And then I'm going to show you for some of the rest of the world, which is kind of, I think you'll find interesting. And I'll give you a link after this is over. I'll give you a link to this app so you can play with it. But they give you a lot of ways of displaying here. And this, you can display the total cases. And so this is the total cases, which is active plus recovered plus deaths. And so that's what they have in total cases. But if you want a breakdown, then the breakdown gives you these are the number of people that have recovered. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna go back. I didn't want to. This is the first. I wanted to click on this thing that says cumulative cases. So this is the cumulative cases that they had in Canada. So you can see this 85,000. This is 85,000 up here. It's the same number, a cumulative. And of those 34,000 were active. So this was the number that were active. This is the number that recovered. And this is the number that died. So it's plotted that way. Now, this is just raw data. If you wanted to look at it per 100,000, you click on this, and then that shows you the cumulative data per 100,000. So when you're comparing countries or provinces, you know, you probably want to normalize to 100,000 cases. So this is the there's 90 active cases per 100,000, and you can see how many recovered. the other thing that you kind of want to know is not the cumulative, but you want to know how many new cases there were on each day. So the new cases are the slope of this line. So you can see that these lines are sloping up. So if we look at the new cases, it just basically a plot of that slope, and so you can see that this is the number of new cases of recovered per 100,000. This is the number of new deaths, which is probably doesn't even show up per 100,000 here. And I just changed the scale to raw data over here. And they don't show active cases on this because the number of active cases could have decreased in a particular day. It could have been negative. So they don't show the negative cases on here. And the other thing you can do is, instead of showing it for every day, you can do a 7-day average. So here's the 7-day average, and this is the 7-day average per 100,000. So they take the average number of cases for a week and average it. And then if you go down here, they show this for every province. You know, you can do the same thing. You can show the total number of cases for Alberta, the cumulative, and you can show a breakdown of the cases. You can see that at one time they had quite a breakout, but it's recovering quite nicely. So there's any questions about this app? So it's a good way. You can, so when they talk about the cases in Contra Costa County, I assume that they mean total cases, and some are active, some are recovered, and some of the people have died. Now, in terms of testing, suppose you had a certain population, like the population of Contra Costa County, and you wanted to know how many people had active, if you had active case, what would they test for? Would they test for an antibody or would they test for the virus? And
the virus.
yeah, if in fact you had an active case, you test for the virus. If you wanted to know how many people recovered, you test for the antibody, because as Jessica told you, that once you get an active virus, the body produces antibodies to fight off the virus, and then these antibodies stay in your body for, we don't know how long, but it could be for several years. It could be for less than several years. And now, if you want to know how many people have died, that's relatively easy. You just test if they have a pulse or not, and you can determine how they died. So there's 3 tests here. Active is test for the virus, recovered is test for the antibody, and then feel a person's pulse to see if they're alive or not. Okay, now
does the active people, do they have the virus in them and have recovered too?
no,
I don't understand the difference between active and recovered.
No, active, they have a virus in them, so they're really sick. So it's like if you catch a flu and you have the flu, then you have an active flu virus in you. So you're sick. When you get over the flu, then you've recovered from the flu. So within a population, there's some people that actively have the virus and they're sick. And then there's some people that have recovered from the virus. And it's important to know if you actively have the virus, because if you actively have the virus, you're infectious. So you can infect other people. So they basically would put you in quarantine in that case.
I see.
And if you've recovered, you have antibodies to the virus. So in principle, although it's not quite sure for the coronavirus if you could go out and not get it again. So that's what the word means, active. You know, if you got the flu, you know you have the flu. And if you recovered from the flu, you know, you kind of know that also. So I'm just going to spend a little time and look at some different countries just for the heck of it. And okay, so here's the coronavirus, and this is the total number of, we're looking at the total number of cases. We're looking at a 7-day average and per 100K population. So here's Canada in black, and here's Italy. So and this is days after the first 100 cases. That's zero on this graph is when they had 100 cases. Italy had a great outbreak, but they managed it very well with social distancing, and so their 7-day average of cases is dropping very, very nicely. United Kingdom, not so much. They're finally starting to reduce the number of cases, and the red on top is United States, which is again not so much. They're not practicing social distancing that well, and so the number of cases is not dropping. And one of the things we could do is if we look at the deaths, it's the same kind of thing. Here's the United Kingdom. United Kingdom has quite a few deaths, and the United States not so bad, not so good on the number of deaths. And I'm going to pull down just one more here. This is the Scandinavian countries, and one of the things you can see that one of the ones that is doing the best on the number of cases is Norway, and the one that's doing the poorest is Sweden. And you can see a lot of talking on the television that Sweden is not really practicing social distancing, and so one doesn't expect that their number of cases is going to drop as rapidly as countries that are doing social distancing. And you can also look at deaths, and Sweden's way up there on deaths compared to the other countries.
Hey, Bob, are you going to give us the link to this website?
Yeah.
Okay. I should just mention, maybe I did before, our daughter and her family live in northern Italy, right in the Lombardy region. Mm-hmm. And you know, that was the place that was hit so terribly bad. And they're just starting to come out of the lockdown. We talk to her daily, but it was so aggressive with the social distancing. They had police monitoring the streets, and they lived in Milan. You couldn't leave your block. If you had to carry a document with you and your identification everywhere you went. You had to have a mask on. And she was stopped a couple times just walking to the grocery store just to identify where she was, where she lived, and was that the closest grocery store. And it was only a 2-block walk. So they were incredibly aggressive in not only social distancing, but just keeping everybody inside.
And you can see by this graph, the graph that I just showed with Italy, it worked. You know, they had a terrible outbreak in Italy, and they managed to keep it under control. Just another interesting kind of one here is, let me see. This is an interesting one. Is you can see that Australia and New Zealand have completely knocked it down to almost nothing, And they're islands, so you know that it's probably a little bit easier for them. One other thing about this graph before I leave it, in case any of you want to play with it, is you can make your own graph. You can choose a region here. Suppose, let me go back and say that we want to throw China in here. So I'm going to choose a region, and so I'm going to get rid of the United Kingdom and put China in here. So okay, so
Whoever's looking at their abdominals, please mute your Zoom.
Yeah, somebody's got a radio on back there.
okay, so I've added China here, and this is in terms of deaths. And you know, if you want to have cases, you can do that. So oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say China's not doing as well as I thought they were, but China is this greed at the bottom that you can see here. So let me go up to cases and see if China, I can get, here's China, where the outbreaks started. And so this is the cases per 100,000. And if you looked at the raw data, of course, it would be higher. But cases per 100,000 in China is just negligible. Okay, so much for these graphs. I thought I'd show them to you. You can, I'll send you a link to them. You can play with them. Okay, now, so that we've talked about prevalence, and if we spent as much time talking about the other words here, you know, it would take a long time. But these words that I have here can be organized in a table, and so on this next slide, I'm showing you the table, and if you understand what I'm going to tell you about this table, then everything else will be downhill. So I'm going to try to be really careful about explaining what this table means. And so why don't you all really kind of pay attention and see if you can understand this table. And I called it a helpful table because it is really a helpful table. If you start looking it up on the internet, you know, it might be called a 2x2 contingency table, or it might be called a confusion matrix. And some of you may be leaving thinking confusion matrix is a better name, but let's see if we can understand this table. So what I'm plotting on the vertical axis is the true condition. And what is the condition? What do I'm kind of using a little bit general terms, but condition could mean one of three things, you know, based on what we've been looking at previously. The condition could mean that you have the active virus. Condition could mean that you recovered from the virus, or condition could mean that you died, you're dead. You know, so condition could mean any one of those things. And then the question is the condition true or not? So if it's true, that means you do, let's assume that condition means active virus. So if it's true that you have the active virus, that means you're sick with the with the virus. And now I put a letter up here, B. It means the same thing as what's written down here. B means the true condition, but I just put it there just as a shorthand term. Predictive condition. What does predictive condition mean? Well, it really means the same as a test. So you have a test, and if the test comes out positive, that means you had a test and it says you had an active virus. So if you did a test for the virus, then you had the active condition. Well, it doesn't mean you had it. It means you tested positive. You tested positive for the virus if you're here. Or if I tested for the antibody, then we tested for the antibody over here. And I can use the letter A actually to mean the same thing. So now let's see if we can figure out. The other thing I did on this table is I normalized it. Instead of normalizing it to 100,000, as they did in the previous examples that I looked at, I normalized this to 1. So that means that if you look at all the numbers that I have over here, S, T, U, and V, the values, they'll all sum up to 1. So I'm basically looking at fractional relationships. If they summed up to 100, then I'd be looking at percentages. Okay, so the first question, how would you define prevalence? And let's say, what's the prevalence for an active case of COVID-19? Can anyone look at the numbers and say what the prevalence of active cases of COVID-19 is?
True positive?
Well, not quite.
Necessarily, because a false negative would be have to be included.
Yeah, so look, if you look at the true condition here, this says positive. So the sum of this one and this one means that you had the condition. So which meant if we're talking about the condition being an active virus, the sum of this and this would mean you had the active virus, and that would be the prevalence of people with the active virus. Or the other thing, just going back again, the other thing you could do is the condition could be the sum of all three. It could mean you had the active virus, or you recovered from the active virus, or you were dead.
Yeah.
And, that could be the condition, could be all three. And that's kind of what we were talking about before. And that's basically what they report when you talk about the number of cases that you see on TV. And I think there was an article about 2 or 3 weeks ago in the New York Times, 2 or 3 days ago, not weeks ago, that they were complaining that they were lumping both of the active cases and the recovered cases and the deaths together. And they said, what good does that do us? We don't really want to know what the total is. We want to know what the active, which ones are active and which ones are recovered. We want a better breakdown. And so the CDC says, well, we weren't doing that on purpose. It just, the number of tests for the antibody was so small, we just threw it in there, was their explanation, which is okay. Okay. So let me ask you another question. So I'm going to be talking about true condition and predicted conditions, so we don't have to distinguish between what the condition is. So the percentage of the population that has the fraction of the population that has a true percentage is the true positive plus the false negative. Now, predicted condition, that's test. What fraction of the population tested positive? Can anyone tell me what that is? So it's
58.
58, that's the right answer. So this one and this one tested positive. Okay, so these are the people that tested positive. Okay, so let me try a harder one. So we know what the true positive and false negative are, and we know what the sum of these two are. What is a true positive? Can anyone kind of guess what a true positive might be? Well, it's the number of people. It's the number of people that have the condition, which is S plus U. And of those people that have the condition, it's the number that tests positive. So
It's easy. It's easy to understand. He makes it hard.
So 48% of the people that have the condition test positive for it.
Yeah.
This is
So
wait, maybe. I
Of
don't want to
96% of the people
Go
who
ahead.
have it test positive.
Yeah, the number of people, the number of people, 50 people have the condition. And so 48 out of 50 people test.
Opposed here. Two.
Yeah, 48 out of 50 so 96% of the people that do have the condition test positive for the condition.
Yeah.
Bob, where did those numbers come from? Where does the 48, the 02,
Oh,
the 10?
I just threw some numbers in there.
So those are just assumed numbers because we obviously don't
Example.
know that unless we've got some other method of deducting that information.
I understand.
Well, and yeah, basically what this is, let me try to explain this a little better than I have been. It turns out that we see that 50, when we add these up, 50% of the people have the condition. We determine that have the condition, and of those, 48 tested positive. So that means 48 out of 50 of the people that had the condition tested positive. So that's 0.96 tested positive. So wait, I didn't want to get myself confused here.
I understand.
I think you said that correctly. The sample space is these two boxes. And of that sample space, 96% of that test positive.
90, yeah, but that's not the truth positive. 96% of the people that have the condition test positive.
Yeah.
And the word for that is the sensitivity. I was trying to show you what we were talking, the word, that's this word sensitivity over here. So in this particular case, if we had a test, this test would have a sensitivity of 96%. Okay, the other opposite of that is the specificity. And the number of people that don't have the condition, which is 50% don't have the condition. You add this one and this one up. And the fraction of the people that don't have it, 0.4 of those 0.5 don't have the condition. So this thing has a specificity of 80%. So sensitivity is a word that tells you, if you have a test, how well the test identifies people that have the disease in a population of people. How many people, what percentage test positive in a population of people that have the disease? And specificity tells you what percent test negative in a population of people that don't have the disease. That's negative, that's specificity. Now I'm going to take a deep breath here, and well, how one of the questions is, what are these two words important for, sensitivity and specificity?
True positive, false positive, sensitivity.
Is someone talking? These two words, sensitivity and specificity.
Okay.
Jessica, mute.
Okay, so we're going to talk about these words. We just gone to the table and talked, and if you followed what I, with a little help from the others, were saying, is that with these numbers, you have a sensitivity of 96% and a specificity of 80%. And this basically, what this does is it tells you how good the test is. It doesn't tell you anything about whether you have the disease or not. It just tells you how good the test is. And so if you were a manufacturer of a test, you could be given, you would want to see how good your test is. So you'd be given a bunch of samples, and you may know, you may be given a batch of positive samples, or you may be given a batch of negative samples, or they may be mixed up altogether. But in either case, somebody knows which samples are positive and which samples are negative. So they run them through whatever test you have. And if 96% of the ones that are positive, you actually identify with your test as being positive, then your test has a sensitivity of 96%. And if
True. The true.
What, I think I said that right. If 96% of the ones that are known to be positive, you identify as positive, then your test has a sensitivity of 96%. And if 80% of those that are negative, your test says they're negative, then your test has a specificity of 80%. So that's basically how you test your machine. You know, you run it through these tests, and then if you run it through enough tests and you have FDA approval for your test, then you can claim these kinds of numbers. But that's really not, if you're a patient or you're a doctor calling for a test, that's not really what's important. What do you want to know if you have a test? If you, suppose you go and take a test and you test positive for the corona, test positive for the virus, then you want to know what's the probability that I have the virus. And, or if you test negative, you want to know what's the probability that I don't have the virus. And when you're talking about that, you're talking about the positive predictive value of the test. Or sometimes they just use the word precision for the positive predictive value.
The meaning of it. Really.
Or the negative predictive value says, I took a test and the test says I'm negative. You know, what confidence can I have that I really don't have the virus? You know, so that's what these two numbers mean. So it's, when we go back to this table, it's just, we flip the rows in the columns. And another comment that I might make is, when you're determining the sensitivity and specificity, that's based on tests that you have done. So you typically talk in terms of fractions or percent. When you're going to take a test, you don't talk in terms of fractions and percents anymore, you talk in terms of probabilities. So if a certain fraction, if you flipped a coin that was a bad coin and it came up heads, you flipped it 1,000 times and it came up heads 60% of the time, you know, that's the test. But then if you were to flip it one more time, then you say, what's the probability that it's going to come up ahead? And that would be 60%. And that's kind of the same language that's used here, is when you're specifying how good the machine is, you talk about fractions. And when you want to know how good your test is going to be, you talk about percents. So let's see if we can figure out what positive predictive value or precision is. So I took a test, and what's the probability? The test said that I tested positive. What's the probability I had the disease? So we come back to this table here, and we tested positive. So you can see that when they ran the test here, 50% of the people tested positive. Some of them were true positives and some were false positives, but 50% tested positive. Of that 50%, 48 of, say that's 0.5, of that 0.5, 0.48 were true positives, and 0.1 were false positives. you tested positive even though you didn't have the disease. But the fact that 0.48 out of 0.5 are tested positive means that the probability that the positive predictive value of that test is this 0.48 out of 50, or in this case, it's 96% again. Well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't add these numbers up right. The 0.48 plus 0.1 is 0.58. So 0.48 out of 0.58 is a positive predictive value of this test. So if you've tested positive, then 0.48 over 0.58 is the likelihood that what's the word I'm looking for when I flip a coin? It's the probability. It's the probability that you tested positive. It's the probability that you do have the disease. And okay, so you kind of get, yeah, I think I didn't explain this well enough that you really all of you didn't understand this first time around, but you can kind of go to this table and you can see that every one of these terms are defined in ratios of pieces on this table. There's one last one left over. No one ever uses this word, but accuracy. Accuracy is a test. You can use that word. How would you define accuracy? I guess you would say that you look at this table and say, if the condition is positive and it tests for positive, or if it's negative and it tests negative, then if you sum these up, which this is 48 and this is 40, that sums up to 88 out of the total, 88%. So you'd say that this particular test had an accuracy of 80%.
Yeah, you really can't funnel those results down into one number. You need at least two, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I think that's kind of right. Do people in general think they kind of get the gist of how you use this table? And if you went back and took a look at this table, you could probably figure out what these words mean.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
And the thing it's very difficult to do, it would be a fun exercise, is look up these words in a dictionary. And it's really hard to understand the dictionary definition without something like a table like this to really understand what the words mean. The other
Can
thing,
I interject a moment?
yeah.
In terms of the clinical situation, the word accuracy means that you're testing for COVID-19, that what is not showing up on your test is SARS or MERS or any of the other 20 or so coronaviruses out there. That's what accuracy means.
Yeah, but okay. But some of these words in different conditions have slightly different meanings. But aren't we kind of saying the same thing? If you're testing for COVID-19 and you test and it's positive, but the positive is a true positive, that's good. And if you test and it's negative, that means it's something else. But it says it's not COVID-19, then that's good. You know, if it's not COVID-19 and you get a negative result. So if you wanted to quantify the two of those together, you know, if you added the fractional numbers together, then that would be the higher the number, the better the test for discriminating COVID-19 from the other
No, you're right. I agree.
from the other ones. The other word that has got many meanings, and even in the context of some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, is sensitivity. And in some testing, when they say you have a very sensitive instrument, they're not really talking about accuracy. They're saying that if there's a very small amount of the thing that you're trying to detect, and you actually detect that it's there, then your instrument is a very sensitive instrument. So if you had, say, 3 viruses, and you're in the sample that you took, and your instrument could test for 3 viruses, that would be a pretty they would say that's a very sensitive test. But that's using the word sensitivity in a different context. Okay, so what on this next slide here, what we've been talking about, I just put the formulas here, and we had this table here, and I basically said that all of these add up to 1, so we normalized to 1. We could have, and so we're talking about fractions, and we could have normalized to 100, which we would have been talking about percent, or we could have normalized to 100,000 like they did in the thing.
Bob,
Mhm.
in most real tests, there is actually a indeterminate prediction. There's actually a third row. It's not positive, negative. It's positive, negative, no result.
No, well, yeah, I actually was involved. You couldn't tell it from this presentation, but I was involved in designing instruments. And I would like to have used that third column. And you're typically not permitted to use a third column. You know, I mean, in principle, you could say we couldn't determine from this test what it was. This means this test is no good. So we'll go on to a different test and test it. But things get very complicated when you use that I don't know column. And so they like to say, you either say it's true or you say it's false, and then all these terms apply. So this is just a 2x2 matrix. When you get that I don't know matrix, things get extremely complicated.
Right, but in your experience and mine, what you're forced to do is to set the cutoff at a level where your actual probability of type 1 errors is very low. So if the outcome could be clear or red and you get pink, or then what you do is you basically set the level of pinkness very low and assume that and only sort of report a positive result when it's almost no pink. And so technologically, the test designers tend to manipulate these numbers. They're not inherent in the nature of the test. They're inherent in the way the test gets designed and implemented.
I'm actually gonna talk about that a little bit more. But if you set the threshold very low, then that means you're gonna get a lot of false positives. You know, if you set the threshold very low, things are going to be reported positive. even though they're not. So you're going to get a lot of false positives. I'm going to talk about that a little more, and we can discuss that. We can discuss that.
Bob, can I ask a question to help get my mind going in the right direction? These numbers that I asked about before, the 0.4, et cetera, are those example, and it's simply an example that you're giving, that if in evaluating the efficacy of a certain kind of test, somebody gave a lab 100 samples. In that 100 samples, 50 were positive and 50 weren't. The person running the test doesn't know that.
Right.
The person running the test runs those tests with the 100 samples and got 48 positive, or no, got 58 positives and 42 negatives. Is that the data we're looking at here?
Yeah, let me suppose I give you, I think you're saying the right thing. Suppose I give you 100 samples.
Right.
And suppose 50 are positive and 50 are negative. Okay.
Right.
And that's what I said here. 50 are positive and 50 are negative. Now, one of the things, if you're just testing the machine and you really believed everyone was honest, then basically I could give you the 50 samples that were positive, which would be these samples here. And I would say, test these samples on your machine. And so you'd put those samples on your machine and you'd say, well, 40 of them tested positive and 48 tested positive and 2 tested negative.
Right.
So that's what these numbers are over here.
Yeah.
So then you could say my machine has this certain sensitivity. That's
Right.
that would define the sensitivity
Right.
of these. But then he could give you a bunch of negative samples. And you can say of these negative samples, 50 negative samples, 40 tested negative and 10 tested positive.
Yeah, exactly. That clarifies everything. And that makes all the sense in the world. Where that for the source of this particular example, and we need the example to help sort this all out. Yeah, that answers the whole shooting match for me. Thank you.
Yeah, but there were 100 samples. The other thing could have happened is that somebody gave you the 100 samples and didn't tell you which was which, but they knew, and so then they could.
Right. But you would have gotten the same results. You would have
Oh.
just said, I've got 58 positives and 42 negatives. And then
No.
once you identified which were which, then you could evaluate the machine.
No, you wouldn't have actually. If they gave you the 100 samples,
You
You
get
just-
58 positives.
you get 58 positive.
Right. That's what I thought I said. That's what I
Okay,
meant to
yeah,
say.
you get 58. Some of them would be true positives, some would be
Right.
false positives.
Exactly.
Okay, and so these are just the formulas that we've been talking about, so we don't have to go into them anymore. And the other way it happens is, suppose somebody came to you and said, I have a machine, I have a tester machine, and it has this sensitivity and it has this specificity. And could I fill in this, given the sensitivity and specificity, could I fill in this table? Could I determine from those numbers what S, T, U, and V are? And so basically, with only those two things, you couldn't. You have two equations. For talking arithmetic, you have two equations for unknowns. So you can't determine these numbers. But if you know that they're normalized to 1, that's yet a third equation. And if in fact they tell you what the prevalence is that we're talking about, if they say for a population with this prevalence, then you have yet another equation here. And so So with the sensitivity, specificity, prevalence, and knowing what the normalization is, you can solve for these these quantities, these S, T, U, and V variables. And so that's basically what this next page does here, is it shows how you can solve for those tables. And once you've got the numbers in this table, you can calculate all these other numbers, other quantities very simply. And while I'm here, I'm not sure that I want to actually go through this, but this table basically contains Bayes' theorem is contained in this table right here. And I think I'll go through here and use this table to derive Bayes' theorem. So, and I'm just going to use A and B when I'm talking about this. So the overall probability of A, we said that overall is S plus T. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So the overall, the probability of B, given that A is true, and probability of B means that B is true, and given that A is true, so that's simply S over S plus T. Did you follow that? Probability of B given that A is true. Probability that A is true is this one plus this one. Probability of B given that puts you right in this right over here. It's S over S plus T. That's what we were talking about before. And if you multiply these together, you get the probability of A times the probability of B given A is true. So this is the sum of a probability, and this is a conditional probability. But you can do the same thing. You can do the same thing instead of, you can do it all over again. You can say that the probability of B is S plus U, and the probability of A being true, given the condition that B is true, is S over S plus U. So that's basically, where am I over here? So probability of B is S plus U, and the probability of A given S. And when you multiply them together, they give you S. So you multiply them together and you get this quantity here, which is S. So this is actually a form of Bayes' theorem. This probability of A times the probability of B given A is the probability of B times the probability of A given B. And you can arrange this any way you want. And so if we divide by probability of A, we get this form of Bayes' theorem. This is just one of the forms of Bayes' theorem. And one of the things, this is Bayes' theorem. One of the things I did is, Jessica said I was going to talk about what is it called when you get resistance?
Herd immunity.
Herd immunity, that's the word I was looking for. I was going to talk, I said I wouldn't talk about herd immunity, but saying I wouldn't talk about herd immunity, I decided I would talk about herd immunity. And so I gave a little example of Joe's sweatshop, but I'm not really sure that, if I had someone to volunteer to read this, like if there were an actress in the crowd, maybe they could read this and we could understand the story of Joe's
What
sweatshop.
is it you want on the reading? I don't
I
understand.
want somebody to read this little story about Joe's sweatshop.
Well, I mean, I can read it.
Yeah, well,
Anybody could read it. You want me to read it?
yeah, read it just so we understand it.
The town of Corville had been ravaged by the virus responsible for COVID-19. By imposing social distancing, the mayor had reduced the number.
Oh, I guess.
Oh, I'm sorry, the mayor had reduced the number of new COVID-19 cases to a level low enough to allow closed businesses to reopen. By that time, 50% of the residents of Corville had had COVID-19 and recovered from it. It is expected that these recoveries all have antibodies to the virus and are protected from a second infection. Joe, the owner of Joe's Sweatshop, reasons that the recoveries would be good people to hire as he reopened his business since they were unlikely to be reinfected by the virus. There are many people to choose from since in Corville, prevalence is 0.50 or 50%. The company Bargain Testing was offering an inexpensive antibody test with the following specifications: sensitivity of 0.96, specificity of 0.80. Joe had spent some of the social distancing time studying clinical and Bayesian statistics, so he plans to use Bayes' formula rather than our helpful table to determine PPV. PPV is the fraction of a population who test positive and have the disease. P, that is what, A over B, or B, I'm sorry, B given A is the probability of having the disease if the test is positive. These are different ways of saying the same thing. PPV equals P, B given A. Similarly, P,
probability of B
equals the true positive plus the false negative equals prevalence equals 0.5. P, probability of A given B equals sensitivity equals 0.96. Probability of A equals true positive plus false positive. Prevalence equals prevalence times sensitivity.
You don't have to read anymore. Okay.
Okay.
So basically, what he did is he put these, there's a thing missing here, but he put these into Bayes' theorem and determined, so what he wanted to do, what he wanted to know was the
So what is B and what is A?
B and A are just like as we determined up here before. B is that you have the disease.
Okay.
And A is that you had the condition. So what he wants to know, is the probability of B, which is the probability that the true condition in this case was that you have antibodies. You had the disease and you have antibodies to the disease. And so now you can't be reinfected. And so that's what he wants. He wants you to have antibodies to the disease so that he can bring you into the sweatshop and you're not going to get reinfected again. So he gets this company that for a good price will do the testing for him to see if you have they'll do an antibody test and test to see if you have the antibodies. Now, this is their test. It's got 96.96 sensitivity, 0.80 specificity. So he plugs it into Bayes' formula that we just discussed. And he says, well, the probability that you have the antibodies, given that you tested positive, is 0.8327 or 83%. So he, he has to decide whether it's worthwhile to get this test, to test if you have antibodies. And if you do test that you have antibodies, it's only 83% accurate. So, he could bring people into his plant that tested positive for antibodies, but only 83% of them would have the immunity that he hoped that they would have. So, I was going to say that's the end of this part of the presentation, but.
Can I just ask a question here?
Yeah.
You're saying, does the test distinguish between those who have the active virus and those who have antibodies?
They're different tests.
Oh, they're different tests.
They're two different tests. One test, the test for the antibody is immunoassay test. And one of the things I said, I would tell you what an immunoassay test was, that test for the antibodies. The other one is a test for the virus. And that's a PCR test, which translates to polymerase chain reaction test. And it actually tests for the DNA of the virus. And if in the sample that you take has viral DNA in it, it'll detect that viral DNA. And the antibody test is typically, they take a blood sample and the antibodies are in the blood. If it's a viral test, they do a throat swab or a nose swab. They do a swab of some kind, and they test for the virus. But there's not many viruses there. So one of the things that they have to do is, using that virus as a seed, they have to copy it many, many times. And they basically copy it so that with a PCR test, if you start with one, the next round you have 2, 4, 6. So it's a, what do you call that sequence? Exponent. It grows exponentially. You keep growing more and more viruses. They call these replicons. And if you do it about 36 times, you have 2 to the 30, start with 1, you have 2 to the 36 viruses. So that's the PCR test. I'm obviously not going to get through all the tests this time, but that's probably okay. This is, I think, was who was talking about, Chas was talking about. If you do a test, you set a threshold. And this is the idea, just to finish this off. This is that same little useful table that we had before. And I actually didn't want to draw these, so I went to the internet and picked them up. And these are a part, this is another test, it's called a ROC test, ROC test. And it's receiver operator characteristics. And it's another way of telling you how good the test is. And that's what this curve down here is. And it basically is a way of, if you plot the sensitivity of your test against 1 minus the specificity, if you have a perfect test, when you plot them, the plot will cover a great area here. And if you have a lousy test, when you plot them, it'll be a straight line like this. That's what a ROC curve is all about. But more than that, I just want to tell you what I'm trying to show you here. So when you do a test, in a lot of tests, you might get a response, and the response might be a color. Say you you have a dipstick that you did a test in, you dip it in a solution, and you it changes color. And it turns out that, well, dip it in a solution, if say it's a pregnancy test, you might dip it in urine and you'll get a color change. And so that's an example of a test. And so suppose the color is red. I'm not talking about a pregnancy test in particular, but suppose if it's negative, it's kind of white. It's kind of white. So this is very white here. And then as you go more and more, it starts getting pink, and then it gets a little bit more and more reddish. And this is the density. So this is the number of tests. You kind of have to understand what density is, but if you integrate density from here to here, well, let me back up a little bit. I'm going to go about this another way. True positives. These are the responses, colors of red that are really positive. If it's a really positive sample, then this curve here are true positives, and the true positives are actually this color plus the purple. So if this were really drawn right, everything here is a positive. These are all positives, and this plus the purple are true positives. Vice versa, for negatives, the responses look like this. So the blue plus the FP plus this is a number of negatives. And in this case, we said we had a prevalence of 50, so half of them are negative, half of them are positive. So one of the things you can do, as someone said, I think it was Chas, is you can set this threshold. You can decide, well, there's a certain level of redness. I'm going to decide at that redness, I'm going to call them negative. If it's redder than that level, I'm going to say it's positive. So you can see that this blue here would be a true negative. You predicted it was negative. It belonged to this negative population. It's a true negative. This population, you said it was wasn't red enough, was negative, but it was really belonged to this population here. So it's a false negative. So that goes over here. Vice versa, when we're talking about true positives, then this red plus purple, this area is all, these are all true positives. This is a false positive because it's truly negative, but you predicted it was a positive because it was above the threshold. So that's a false positive. And then this is a false negative. So this is kind of a way you can generate the numbers in this curve. Now, the thing you can do is you might say, well, gee, I have too many false negatives. Well, suppose you don't want any false negatives. You say it's testing negative, but it's really positive. So what you can do is you can just move your threshold in this direction. Or if you say, well, it's really important that if I say it's positive, it's truly positive. I don't want any false positives. So what you do is is you move the threshold in this direction, then you don't have any false positives. And you can kind of see how a manufacturer can adjust the numbers, have a trade-off between true positives and the numbers in here by just moving the threshold that he has on his instrument, you know, where he decides that is positive or negative. And the suggestion was, well, rather than making the decision as positive or negative, you could say, well, there's certain shades of red that I really can't make up my mind, you know, if it's positive or negative. So I'll just say, you know, can't make up my mind. I could put another region there and say, I can't make up my mind, but that's not permitted. And you can imagine on a pregnancy test, if you did it and at one result it says, well, you're either negative or you're positive, or for the most part, I can't make up my mind. You know, that would not be a very good test. And the best tests, this distribution of true negatives is very sharp here. It would go up and come down, and the true positives would go up and come down, and there'd be very little overlap. And if there's very little overlap in that case, then this curve would go up and across like that. If in fact they totally overlapped, if there was no way to, if this curve totally overlapped this curve, then the curve, then this plot would look like this, and that would mean it's like flipping a coin. The test tells you nothing. Okay. Anyone survive this part?
Oh, that was good. That was very interesting.
Very good.
I'm here.
Okay. So we have half an hour left. Go ahead.
Bob,
Mhm.
would you care to comment on how retesting makes such a big difference in the numbers and is the reason that we frequently are retested?
Well, there's two answers. You asked two different questions. One is in fact, let's assume that the tests were perfect, had an accuracy of 100% accurate. You know, that when they said positive, you were positive. When they said negative, you were negative. Well, they might test you for the virus and you test negative, but you're not negative for life. You know, 3 days later, they may test you and you may test positive. So that's the reason that you don't just get one test for the virus, you keep getting more and more tests to see if you have an active virus. On the other hand, if you test positive for antibodies, then if that means and it's a 100% accurate test, that means you have the antibodies. And if you get tested again, the test will turn out the same. You'll always have the antibodies. So there's no point in getting tested multiple times for the antibody test. Once you test positive, and then means you had it, so you're not going to get it again. But for the virus, you may test negative, and if it's a 100% accurate test, you know, 3 days later, you may actually catch the disease, and so you test positive.
What I'm referring to is changing the probabilities. In other words, if you test positive on the first test and an hour later you take it again, then the fact that the test is not perfect, you actually are making the test more accurate or more you're improving the statistics. In other words, if you do the 2x2 matrix for 2 tests, you get different numbers than for 1 test. And if it's a high stake test, you do want to give it to the patient or the person or the machine. I mean, the high-stake test, whether you're measuring a component for a rocket to Mars or you're measuring sort of COVID-19. You know, it's the old measure twice, cut once. That there is a reason for doing that, and it's here in the probabilities you've discussed.
Yeah, you could do that. And, you know, it's the same with Bayes' theorem. You know, if in fact the prevalence of a disease was, say, 50%, then if I picked a random person out of that population, then the chances of them having the disease is 50%. But then if I test them for the disease, then I get some more information. So that updates the information that I have. And, you know, then that gives you the positive, that gives you more information that's a positive predictive value. That means you tested them, and so you have more confidence. And if you test them an additional time, you still get a little bit more information. You know, so you can add that on to the information you had. And you can,
Yeah, if you have an example would be if you needed to know very accurately if somebody is testing positive, the test is 90% predictive that way. If you test positive, you've got a 90% chance of having what you're tested for. If you take the same test over again and you test positive, then the percentage that you have what you're testing for goes up quite dramatically, something like 99%. And if you test a third time, it gets even more predictive. So if you really want to know whether you're testing for something and you want that test to be extremely accurate to the question of whether you have that condition or not, then multiple testing increases. If they're all coming out positive, then multiple testing makes that overall probability extremely close to 100%.
yeah, unless you have a particular condition that follows up the test. Then repeating the test over and over again doesn't really help that much. You'd be better off, if that were the case, you do one test and then you do a different test that isn't followed up by that condition. You know, that might be a different strategy.
Yeah, I'm assuming that you don't have that complication.
Yeah, they came out with words, and if you when the virus first came out, and even on this thing I showed you on the Canadian test, they used to use the word presumptive and confirmed. And so they would say that the number of presumptive tests was a certain number, and then the number of confirmed tests for the virus could be a smaller number. And basically the original idea in the US, and I think in Canada also, was you could look at certain conditions and you could say, well, this person's got fever and this and that, so I presume that they have the virus. Or I could do a cheap test, a quick test, and they're presumed to have the virus. And then the idea in the US was then you would send that sample off to the CDC test, which would be the gold standard, which meant that's the real test. And if it tested positive, that would be a confirmed positive. It turned out that the CDC test wasn't very good. So they're still kind of use the word confirmed, but I don't think it means anything. Confirmed by what? I don't know in the US that it's confirmed by anything. And
Bob, you made a mention of I thought you said this, that if your antibody test was positive, then that means you have but there could be false positives for your
No,
antibody test.
I said it was 100% accurate test. That if it had 100% accuracy, then there are no false positives or no false
Okay,
negatives.
got it. I didn't catch that. Thank you.
If I didn't say that, I intended to say that, yeah.
So if you're interested, just generally this group, if you're interested in testing and its relevance to healthcare, reading the National Academy Sciences report on prostate cancer and PSA testing, which turned us from doing lots of testing to not doing any testing pretty much. They have all of the statistical analysis in it and lots of explanations and discussions about how you test for a disease and why you test for a disease and what you do to get good indicators. And it's very much, as Bob has been suggesting, but it gives you a lot of very practical examples.
Could you share that link with Bob, or we could distribute that?
Yeah.
I will try to find it again. I haven't had it for a while because it's, I think, almost 10 years old now, but I'll see if I can dig it out of my records.
Thank you.
Okay. One of the things we could do, I had intended to cover the two different tests, the basics behind the two different tests. But, you know, I thought very likely that this would run over, take more time and there would be very little time left. So we can't cover both tests, but if you wanted to, I could go through the antibody test, which is the test for antibodies, and I should be able to do that in 40 minutes. Or the other thing we could do is we could put both of those off to a different day or not do them. Do you want me to, I'll do the antibody test. It's not hard. And the testing for the virus is a little bit more difficult. So I won't even try to get there, although it's extremely interesting how they do that test. PCR is really quite interesting. But let's go to the antibody test. And so I'm gonna share my screen again. Does everyone see my screen now?
Yep, I do.
Yes.
Okay, so Jessica talked about what an antibody was. And these are proteins which there's 4 different chains of protein. They call these 2 the short chains and these 2 are the long chains. There's probably more elegant words for these chains. And these different chains come together and they form a antibody. So let me kind of stop here. Does everybody know what the difference between an antibody and an antigen is? What I'm showing you, this is the antibody. Then they got some pictures of antigens up there.
I have no idea.
Okay, in COVID-19, we're testing for the virus. And so the antigen is the thing that gets the body to produce antibodies, I'm sorry. So in the case of COVID-19, the antigen would be the coronavirus. So the coronavirus is the antigen, and the way to keep these things apart is the word gen means you generate, this is something that causes the body to generate antibodies. And so it could be a virus, it could be all kinds of, any kind of foreign invader into the body. If the body doesn't recognize that invader, it'll form antibodies, and these antibodies will attack that invader and try to destroy the invader and get rid of it. And that's the basis of an immune reaction. So, and I think Jessica described what the antibody did. Something carried it. It took the virus and carried it into the lymph nodes where some different killer cells or something like that attacked it. And, you got rid of. Is that about right, Jessica? Okay, anyway, this is an antibody. And this is kind of a picture of an antibody. And so what happens is the body generates antibodies and it goes around searching for the virus, which is an antigen. And in this case, this particular shape is the virus. And the antibody, it turns out these yellow parts of these two chains here this is called the highly variable part of the antibody. And these things will mutate very rapidly. And so they'll mutate so that they can cling on to whatever antigen is there that they're trying to get a hold of. And so once they find out a good way to grab a hold of this antigen, then they proliferate at a great rate. And so your body has a whole lot of antibodies in it. And so the antibody test is, we're going to test for the presence of these antibodies, and there's lots of them. And a viral test, which we talk about later some other time, is you're testing directly for the antigen. Okay, so I'm going to take advantage of Bio-Rad again, and well, I'm going to show you kind of how they describe how a test is done. Ooh. Okay, the test that is done is called ELISA. And ELISA means enzyme linked where's the word I want here? Sorbent. Yeah, enzyme linked immunosorbent. I is immuno. Sorbent means sorbent. I'll explain what that is. Antibody test. So the way that happens is they take a well. They take a little, now they show this as a little well here, but what these are microtiter plates. And these are little plates that have little wells in them. And I think there's some of them have 64 little wells in them. Some have 1,024 little wells in them. But these are plates that have little wells in them. And then what they do is they will, suppose you want to test for the virus. The virus is an antigen. Now, this is a terribly insensitive test. This is not a good test, but it's a simple test, and I'll start out with it. So basically what you do is you take a solution and you put the the thing that you took the nasal scrapings with into this solution here, and it's apparently supposed it has some viruses in it. This is not a good test, but it just illustrates the principle. Then the viruses will stick to the bottom. They'll stick to the bottom of the well here. So so that's what they say it's called coating. The bottom of the well is coated with the antigen. And then what they do is, after a while, when they think that the antigen is coated the bottom of the well, they put another material in, a buffer, so that nothing else can stick to the parts of the well that the antigen didn't stick to. Then what they do, if you want to test for the presence of the antigen, you put in an antibody. So you have the antibodies to the antigen. You can manufacture these things, and you attach an enzyme to it. See, so this little blue thing is an enzyme, and then you attach it to the tail of this antibody, and the antibody actually, you put it in the solution, and the antibody finds the antigen and hangs on to it. And in fact, this picture is a little bit wrong. It looks nice, but it's symbolic. You have the two arms of the antibody surrounding the antigen, but that's not really what happens. One of these little arms, the lock or key, this antigen sticks right over here. It doesn't hang in between. But anyway, this is symbolic. And so you have these antigens with enzyme attached to them. I'm sorry, you have these antibodies with this enzyme attached to them, sticking to the antigens at the bottom of the plate. So then you throw out this solution and you add well, in fact, could be the same solution. No, I think you throw it out. You throw out this solution, then you put in another solution that in the presence of the enzyme, it changes color. So you know, like, it's like when you test for acidity or something like that. You know, something speeds up the reaction. If it's an acid in there, it speeds up a color change. So these enzymes speed up a color change in the substrate that you add. And so that you look at the color of the substrate, and depending on what shade of, in this case, yellow it is, you can determine how many antigens were in the bottom of this plate. So this is what is called direct ELISA. And it's okay if you have a lot of the antigen and you want to test for it, you can just test for the antigen using direct ELISA. But in fact, they don't do this with the COVID virus. They use PCR, which we'll discuss some other time. Okay, now the test that is actually used. So this was the test that described on the previous. This is what's called direct ELISA, and this is the antigen, this is the enzyme, this is a buffer solution. If you get enough of this enzyme in, the more enzymes, the more color change you'll get. The one that is used, one of the ones that's used for testing for antibodies is what is called indirect ELISA. And so the thing you're testing for is the presence of this antibody. This is the antibody against the COVID-19 virus. So you get a part of the virus that this antibody sticks to, and you coat the bottom of this plate with a portion or a piece of the antibody that, I'm sorry, piece of the antigen that the antibody will stick to. And it could be just one of the spikes on the antigen. And then you introduce the antibody in, and so the antibody sticks to this, I'm sorry, you introduce the solution that contains the antibodies that you're testing for into the container. So if you did a nasal swab, you would put whatever was contained in the nasal swab into the solution and sorry, we're testing for antibodies. So you take a blood test. You take a blood test and you have some blood and you get rid of all of the red blood cells in the blood, and you just probably keep the serum that have the antibodies in it, and you put some of the serum into the solution, so that serum has the antibody in it. And so these antibodies will find the corresponding antigen coated to the bottom of the plate. And so that's nice, but then you have to get a color change. So this is called the primary antibody that you're testing for. Then what you do is you add a secondary antibody. And this antibody is designed to attach to the tail end of any antibody. So this is a secondary antibody. And the thing that it looks for is the tail end of another antibody. And so it attaches to the tail end of this antibody, but it has an enzyme attached to it. And so when you put these in, they attach to the tail end of this antibody. And then if you replace the original solution with the solution that changes color in the presence of this enzyme, then you put that solution in and you'll get a color change, and the color change will be proportional to how much of this this antibody, the yellow antibody, there was in the sample that you put in. So that's kind of as far as I'm going to go today. There's another one. It's called a sandwich assay, which is kind of a popular assay. And if you did a pregnancy test, this would be the kind of assay that you'd probably be doing. So did anyone kind of follow what's happening with these ELISA tests?
I think so.
Yes, and it was very interesting.
So you take the blood sample and you purify it somehow. So you just have the part of the blood sample that contains the antibody, and you put it in one of these microplate wells. And these wells have been coated with something that antibody attaches to. And it could be a piece of the original virus and so the more antibodies, there's lots of these things. The more antibodies you have, the more that you have in this microwell. And then you put in a secondary antibody that attaches, the thing that it knows is it attaches to this tail end of another antibody. but it contains the enzyme. And so if you put in a solution that changes color in the presence of this enzyme, then you'll get a color change. And that will tell you how much of this antibody, say, to the coronavirus that you had.
So a simple alternative to this is a light absorptive test where you're measuring the transmissivity through the substance to see how much of a particular color of light was absorbed. There is also stuff you can attach that will luminesce and be a light source, and that's called a chemiluminescent microparticle immunoassay, and it followed from the development of the indirect or ELISA tests, but it is also very popular for certain kinds of tests. And there is yet a third variation on this thing called immunometric assays, which I'm not exactly sure how those work. But Bob, do you know what how an immunometric assay works?
No, I actually don't. And there's many kinds of assays like this. If you look at the immunoassay for a pregnancy test, there are many it's a very complicated immunoassay, and it involves what is called transverse flow. So, you don't put it, in that case, you're looking for the antigen. It's a particular hormone that's present when you're pregnant. And so you're looking for the presence of that hormone. And it kind of uses a sandwich type assay, but it also has lateral flow. So instead of putting the stuff in a little well, you put it on a test strip, and the fluid flows transversely just like it does on filter paper, or if you have a blotter. And so
right.
the stuff moves in it. And so different parts of this strip contain different kind of antibodies and reporters.
Chromatography that we used to use a long time ago to separate out different weights and different types of chemicals.
There's a type of chromatography they actually use in purifying some of these samples before they put them in here. I just did this one as a simple case, and you need to have something. This thing in many different kinds of tests is kind of called like a reporter. This would be called a reporter antibody. It has something on it that reports the presence of this antibody, is which you really are looking for. And you're correct. There's one of the best ways of detecting is fluorescence. And so basically, when I talk about, if we talk about PCR, they use fluorescence in PCR. That's the one that tests directly for the virus.
So most of us, when we get a blood test and we get these long list of results and stuff like that, it's actually done on a machine that involves something called flow cytometry, or lateral flow. Basically, a very small amount of fluid runs through a whole host of tests.
Yeah.
That's very quick. You can line up thousands of samples and they get processed very quickly. Unfortunately, the kind of process that we're using now is batch. You have to process each blood test and then analyze it separately. And although you can involve robots in doing it, it's just much, much slower than the kind of continuous flow processing that we're used to doing for a lot of other things that when we analyze blood. Just isn't the technology yet they're in place to do it with COVID antibodies or the COVID or the SARS-CoV-2 virus that I'm familiar with. I don't know, maybe Bob, you've read something else.
Yeah, I'm a bit familiar with these machines. Actually, prior to working for Bio-Rad, I worked for Beckman Instruments, and they were one of the first companies to develop this machine that tests for multiple things in your blood sample. It'll test for
So a lot of things that I read refer to immunoglobulin or immunogabaglobulin. What role does that play in these tests or in understanding the assay of what they're measuring?
immunoglobulin is just another word for antibody. And I showed you that picture of the antibody, that it was just a nice two strands with a fork on them. But in fact, the actual antibodies don't look like that. You know, they form into little balls and little round structures. That's why they're called immunoglobulins. So the globulins means they're round. So it's the same word. And then there's different kinds of antibodies. There's, I think, the M antibody. Jessica knows this much better than I do, but the body produces different kinds of antibodies first, which have different roles. I think the M1 is the first line of attack, and then there's, you talked about gamma globulin. I think that's just a different kind of antibody, is my understanding of it. Okay.
Bob, my wife Kathleen has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, looking at the antibody test, I was unclear when you put in the second antibody that has the reporter antibody. I'm assuming it would only change the color if it's attached to the primary antibody. Is it? Why wouldn't it just, you put the second antibody in, why wouldn't it just change the fluid color?
Well, I said it, but I didn't stress it. You put it in a certain fluid, and then it's attached to the first antibody. Then you throw the fluid out, and then you put in this different fluid. You wash out all of the unattached ones. The second antibody with the enzyme in it, if it's not attached, it's in the fluid, and then you empty the well, and then you put in a different buffer solution.
Yeah, okay, that clears it up. Thank you.
That this enzyme reacts with, and then you get a color change. That's that. Otherwise, if you had this same fluid in here, when you put the secondary, it would be red as can be. The enzyme would just have the reaction going. But you can wash out all this. I think that's what they call wash the plate. You might wash out all of this substance here. And in fact, I'm familiar with some other assays, just conversation piece. In fact, where they instead of using wells, they use beads, and they attach, say, the antigen to a tiny little beads. And in fact, what they do is some of them use magnetic beads. So at this stage, they take all the beads and attract them to a magnet. Then they wash away all of the stuff that's here. And then they release the magnet. It's an electromagnet, so that you can turn it on and off. And so everything's washed away, and then they add the second solution that they want to add. So that's a case of using magnetic beads instead of these wells. But this is attached to the bottom of this plate. So you can dump the stuff out, and this is not going to go anywhere. It's attached to the bottom of the plate. Okay, let's go ahead.
Oh, I had one more question, but I don't know if you want to go this deeply into it. Everything that you're describing in ELISA is human. Is that right? The initial well, I guess the virus is not human, but the antibody that you put in, then the recorder antibody with the enzyme attached. However, when you're using the fluorescent method, there's nothing in humans that would test fluorescent, I think. So are you using it from another animal, a fish or something like that?
Yeah, no, these are not these are not human enzymes. They're any enzyme which will change the color.
So where do they come from?
Oh, they come from all kinds of places. They come from different bacteria. They may come from different bacteria. And,
okay.
you know, and
so it would be the same with the fluorescent. You're getting it from another source, which is not
yeah,
human.
you get chromophores, and then you get fluorophores. These are things which, when you shine ultraviolet light on them, they fluoresce a particular color, and they're particularly sensitive. They're particularly noise-free way of detecting the presence.
But
of
they
that.
will attach to a human antibody, right?
Oh yeah, you can. It's amazing. You can attach these things to antibodies. Yeah, you can. I don't. You could do amazing things. You know, when I used to work for Bio-Rad, they were coating everything with everything. You know, you can coat the bottom of a well with whatever you want, or you can coat a bead with whatever you want. And they had an instrument which, you know, I'll just mention the instrument, but it's an amazing instrument. They used magnetic beads, but they coated it with 4 different colored dyes. And so on each different dye, you could say attach a different antigen. So that meant, or antibody, which meant it had a different test. So when this went through the machine, you shone one laser on it to excite the dyes, the 4 different dyes, which told you what kind of a bead it was. So if you had 4 dyes, the level, they will say there's 4 levels of the first dye. So that designates 4 different beads. Then the second dye distinguishes between 16 beads. And the third dye distinguishes between 64 different beads. So you could distinguish between 64 different beads, which were coated with 64 different things. So you could do 64, you could test for 64 things at a time with this, just with this machine, because it had 64 different beads with different things attached to them, which, and this kind of an immunoassay test took place. So that's the kinds of things that they can do. Okay, next week, Bob, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Do you want me to? I could do the testing for the PCR tests next week, or you could continue with your stuff next week.
Why don't you do the PCR? And if you do it quickly, I'll get started again. And if not, we'll move it up a week.
Okay, so I'll plan on talking about PCR. PCR is kind of a more complicated test. There's a little bit more to talk about, because one of the things we're going to do is we're going to talk about what DNA and RNA really are. And then PCR is how do you multiply, how do you exponentially grow replicates, they call them replicons of the original strand of DNA. And so I'll start that next week. And if there's time left, you can start, or there probably won't be time left, much time left.
Okay.
But if you're prepared to take it on.
Yeah. I will, not a problem.
Okay, so I'll send this material out, and next week I'll talk about how you actually test for the virus. Okay, thanks everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Bob. This was
Thank
really
you.
Thank you,
well
Bob.
done.
It was really good.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Okay.
Even I understood it somewhat.
Well,
Thank
well, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.